The sun was setting over Atlanta International Airport, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and purple. The private hangar area buzzed with activity as jets arrived and departed, carrying the wealthy and powerful to destinations around the world. Among the mechanics working that evening was Thomas Jackson, a man whose story was about to take an unexpected turn. Thomas had been fixing aircraft for 15 years. At 42, his hands told the story of his dedication, slightly, calloused, steady, and capable of diagnosing problems that younger mechanics often missed. He took pride in his work, knowing that lives depended on his thoroughness. Despite being one of the most skilled technicians at the airport, he often felt invisible, his suggestions sometimes overlooked in an industry where black mechanics made up less than 5% of the workforce. "Hey Thomas, we need that pre-flight check done on the Gulfstream in Bay 3. It's taking off in 40 minutes, called out Bill, the shift supervisor, his voice carrying across the noisy hangar. Thomas nodded and grabbed his toolkit. The Gulfstream G650 was a beautiful machine, one of the most luxurious private jets in the world. This particular aircraft belonged to Richard Westfield, the billionaire founder and CEO of Nexus Innovations. Everyone knew Westfield's name. His technology company had revolutionized cloud computing and was now worth billions. "This one's a rush job," said Luis, another mechanic passing by. "Westfield needs to get to Silicon Valley for some big meeting. The boss is sweating bullets about it." Thomas just smiled. "Fast or slow, the job's the same. These birds don't care who's flying them." He began his inspection with practiced efficiency, moving methodically through his checklist. The cabin pressure system checked out. Electrical systems were functioning perfectly. As he examined the hydraulic systems that controlled the aircraft's flaps and landing gear, something caught his eye, something that didn't look quite right. Thomas paused, frowning. There, barely visible unless you knew exactly what to look for, was a hairline fracture in a critical hydraulic component. Most people would have missed it. Even experienced mechanics might have overlooked it, especially when rushing. But Thomas had seen a similar issue once before years ago, and remembered the instructor at his technical school emphasizing how dangerous such defects could be. "This ain't good," he muttered to himself, bending closer to examine the fracture. If this component failed during flight, the pilot could lose control of crucial systems. At best, it would mean an emergency landing. At worst, Thomas didn't finish the thought. He knew what needed to be done, regardless of whose jet this was or how important their meeting might be. He was logging the issue when Bill appeared at his side, checking his watch anxiously. "We all set here? Westfield's people are calling every 5 minutes." Thomas shook his head. "Can't clear it yet. Found a fracture in the hydraulic system. Need to replace this component before takeoff." Bill's face fell. "Are you absolutely sure? Maybe it's just a scratch in the surface coating." "It's a fracture," Thomas said firmly. "Look here." He pointed out the flaw, explaining the potential consequences. Bill ran a hand through his thinning hair. "How long to fix it?" "If we have the part, maybe an hour. If not..." Thomas shrugged. "Westfield doesn't like delays," Bill said, lowering his voice. "Last time we held up his jet for maintenance, he threatened to take his business elsewhere. The owner nearly had a heart attack." Thomas straightened up, looking his supervisor in the eye. "I'm not letting this plane take off until this part is replaced. I don't care if it's the president on board." For a moment, tension hung in the air between them. Then Bill sighed. "I'll let them know. See if we have that part somewhere." While Bill made the call, Thomas continued checking the rest of the aircraft. His discovery had already set off a chain reaction. The flight crew had been notified. Westfield's assistants were being told about the delay. Somewhere in a VIP lounge, one of the world's richest men was receiving news that his tight schedule was about to be disrupted. Thomas didn't let any of that pressure him. Throughout his career, he'd learned that cutting corners to save time or avoid inconveniencing important people was how mistakes happened, and mistakes in aviation cost lives. The part wasn't in their regular inventory. Thomas felt his heart sink. This could mean hours of delay while they sourced it from elsewhere. Then he remembered something. "What about that older Gulfstream? In maintenance?" he asked Luis. "The one getting the engine overhaul. Doesn't it have the same hydraulic system?" Luis snapped his fingers. You're right. We could borrow the part and replace it later when the new one arrives. After getting emergency clearance, Thomas hurried to the other aircraft. Removing the component was delicate work, requiring steady hands and patience. Sweat beaded on his forehead as he carefully extracted the part. Around him, he could feel the growing impatience. Phones were ringing. Voices were becoming more urgent. The pressure was mounting by the minute. Back at Westfield's jet, Thomas installed the borrowed component with careful precision. This wasn't a job to rush, no matter who was waiting. Each connection had to be perfect, each seal properly seated. When he finally finished, he ran a complete test of the hydraulic system, watching the pressure gauges with total concentration. Everything checks out, he said at last, signing off on the aircraft's maintenance log. She's ready to fly. Bill looked relieved. That's good work. Really good catch. Thomas just nodded and began packing up his tools. Through the open hangar doors, he watched as the massive jet taxied toward the runway, its powerful engines humming. Inside that luxurious cabin sat a man whose time was valued at thousands of dollars per minute, who probably didn't know or care about the mechanic who had just spent an intense hour ensuring his safety. As the Gulf Stream lifted into the evening sky, Thomas felt the familiar mix of pride and resignation. Pride in a job well done, in knowing he'd never compromise on safety. Resignation because he fully expected to face repercussions for delaying such an important client. In his experience, standing your ground often came with a price, even when you were right, especially when powerful people were inconvenienced. Little did he know that his decision that evening wouldn't end his career, but instead open a door he never knew existed. Hope you enjoyed your extra hour in Atlanta, Mr. Westfield, Thomas murmured as the jet's lights disappeared into the darkening sky. Because that hour might have saved your life. 3 days passed since the incident with Westfield's jet. Thomas had gone about his regular duties, fixing various aircraft issues and completing routine checks. He tried not to think about what might come of his decision to delay the Billionaire's flight. But the thought lingered in the back of his mind like a storm cloud that wouldn't move on. It was just after lunch break when Bill, the shift supervisor, approached Thomas as he was elbow-deep in the engine compartment of a small charter plane. Thomas, I need you in my office when you get to a stopping point, Bill said, his expression giving nothing away. Thomas's stomach tightened. This was it, he thought. The fallout he'd been expecting. He carefully finished securing the component he was working on, wiped his hands on a shop rag, and made his way to the small office at the corner of the hangar. Close the door, Bill said when Thomas entered. He settled into his chair with a sigh that seemed to come from deep within. I got a call from upstairs. It's about the Westfield situation. Thomas remained standing, bracing himself. All right, let's hear it. Westfield wants to meet with you. Of all the things Thomas had expected, a warning, a suspension, even getting fired, this wasn't on the list. He wants to what? Meet with you. Personally. When he returns to Atlanta. Bill looked as confused as Thomas felt. His office called this morning. He'll be back next Tuesday and wants to see you then. Did they say why? Bill shook his head. No details. Just that he requested to meet the mechanic who found the hydraulic issue. Thomas leaned against the wall, trying to process this information. That's unusual. Very. In 15 years managing this hangar, I've never had a client ask to meet a mechanic. Bill leaned forward. Look, Thomas, whatever happens, I want you to know you did the right thing. That part you replaced, the boys in the shop examined it afterward. The crack was getting worse. It wouldn't have made it through another flight. The validation felt good, but it didn't ease Thomas's confusion about why one of the richest men in America wanted to see him face to face. The next week crawled by at an agonizing pace. Thomas went about his work, but his mind kept drifting to the upcoming meeting. His coworkers had plenty of theories when they heard the news. Maybe he's going to thank you personally, suggested Luis during their lunch break in the staff room. Give you some kind of reward. Or maybe he wants to see the face of the man who dared to delay him, said Anthony, a newer mechanic, half joking. Rich folks can be funny about their time. Thomas just shrugged and ate his sandwich. Guess I'll find out Tuesday. When Tuesday finally arrived, Thomas made sure to shower thoroughly at home before his shift, scrubbing the embedded grease from around his fingernails. He put on his cleanest uniform, even though it was still worn around the edges from countless washes. His wife had noticed his extra care that morning. "You meeting the president today or something?" She'd teased over breakfast. "Something like that," he'd replied with a nervous smile. The morning passed in a blur of routine tasks. At exactly 1:30 p.m., Thomas received a call on the hangar phone. Westfield's jet had landed, and he was expected at the executive terminal in 30 minutes. Thomas had only been to the executive terminal once before when he'd been called to look at an issue that couldn't be moved to the maintenance hangar. The difference between the areas where he usually worked and this section of the airport always struck him. From the industrial, oil-scented maintenance hangar to the polished floors and hushed atmosphere of where the wealthy passed through. As he approached the security desk, he became acutely aware of his worn uniform and the permanent shadows of grease under his fingernails that no amount of scrubbing could remove. "I'm Thomas Jackson. I have a meeting with Mr. Westfield," he told the receptionist, a young woman in a crisp blazer who looked at him with slight confusion. She checked her tablet. "Yes, Mr. Jackson. They're expecting you. Please follow me." Thomas followed her down a hallway lined with photos of aircraft and past a lounge where well-dressed travelers sipped drinks while waiting for their flights. They stopped at a door marked Private Conference 3. "You can go in. They're waiting for you," the receptionist said, gesturing to the door. Thomas took a deep breath, straightened his shoulders, and walked in. The room was smaller than he'd expected, not the grand office he'd imagined, but elegantly furnished with a polished table and comfortable chairs. At the far end sat a man Thomas recognized immediately from countless news stories and magazine covers. Richard Westfield himself. He was younger looking in person than in photos, probably in his late 40s, with salt and pepper hair and intense eyes that seemed to evaluate everything they saw. Beside him sat an older man in an expensive suit, who Thomas guessed was some kind of assistant or advisor. "Mr. Jackson," Westfield said, standing and extending his hand. "Thank you for coming." Thomas shook his hand, conscious of his own calloused palm against Westfield's smoother one. "Sir, please have a seat." Westfield gestured to a chair across from him. "This is Howard Chen, my chief of operations." The older man nodded but didn't offer to shake hands. Thomas sat down, keeping his back straight, wondering why he felt like he was in a job interview rather than a reprimand. "So you're the mechanic who refused to clear my plane for takeoff last week," Westfield said, his tone neutral, impossible to read. Thomas met his gaze directly. "Yes, sir. I found a fracture in the main hydraulic system that required immediate attention. And you knew this would delay my departure by over an hour?" "Yes, sir. But it wasn't safe to fly without replacing that part." Westfield exchanged a glance with Chen, then leaned forward. "Do you know where I was headed that day, Mr. Jackson?" Thomas shook his head. "No, sir. Just that it was important. A $10 billion acquisition deal in California. Time-sensitive. My being late risked complications." Thomas's heart sank, but he kept his expression steady. "I understand, sir, but my job is to make sure planes are safe to fly regardless of the schedule." The room fell silent for a moment. Thomas could hear the faint sound of an aircraft taking off in the distance. Then, unexpectedly, Westfield smiled. Precisely the answer I hoped to hear. Thomas wasn't sure what to make of Westfield's smile. He'd expected anger, maybe even threats about his job. The smile threw him off balance. "When we landed in California," Westfield continued, "I asked my pilot about what happened. He explained, 'The issue you found, but honestly, I didn't think much of it. Just another delay in a busy schedule.'" Westfield reached into a leather briefcase beside him and pulled out a folder, which he opened and slid across the table. "But then I had my team request this. It's the full inspection report on the part you replaced." Thomas glanced down at the document. It contained detailed photos of the cracked component he'd found, along with an engineer's analysis. "According to our aviation engineers, That fracture would have expanded rapidly under pressure. By their estimate, it would have failed completely somewhere over the Rocky Mountains on our return flight. Westfield's voice had lost its casual tone. We would have lost hydraulic control at 40,000 feet. The weight of those words hung in the air between them. Thomas had known the component was dangerous, that's why he'd insisted on replacing it, but hearing the potential consequences laid out so plainly made his mouth go dry. I've been flying private for 15 years, Mr. Jackson. I've had countless mechanics check my aircraft. Not one has ever had the courage to ground my plane when they found something concerning. Chen, who had been silent until now, spoke up. They always find a way to justify letting it go. It'll hold for one more flight. We'll fix it at the destination. No one wants to be the one to deliver bad news. Thomas shook his head. That's not how I work. If I sign off on a plane, I'm saying it's safe, period. Exactly, Westfield said, leaning back in his chair. And that's precisely why we're having this conversation. Thomas waited, still unsure where this was heading. Do you know anything about my company, Mr. Jackson? About what we do at Nexus? Innovations? Some, Thomas admitted. You're in tech, cloud computing, software, that kind of thing. Westfield nodded. That's our main business. But we've been expanding. 2 years ago, we acquired a small aerospace manufacturing company that specializes in aircraft components. We've been working on next-generation materials for commercial and private aircraft. This was not at all what Thomas had expected to discuss. He nodded, listening carefully. The problem is, Westfield continued, we have brilliant engineers, excellent designers, but we lack people with real-world experience. People who understand what happens when these components are actually in use, year after year, in all conditions. Chen picked up the thread. Our team can run simulations all day, but there's no substitute for someone who's been hands-on with aircraft for years, someone who can spot a problem before it becomes catastrophic. Thomas began to understand where this was going, but it seemed too unlikely. He glanced between the two men, waiting for the other shoe to drop. I believe in recognizing talent when I see it, Mr. Jackson, Westfield said. And what you displayed was more than technical skill, it was integrity. The willingness to make difficult decisions regardless of the consequences to yourself. He leaned forward, fixing Thomas with an intense look. How long have you been a mechanic? 15 years, Thomas replied. And in that time, how many times have you been passed over for promotion? How many less experienced people have moved ahead of you? The question hit home. Thomas had applied for lead mechanic positions 3 times. Each time someone else had gotten the role. Always someone with less experience, usually someone who didn't look like him. A few times, he acknowledged quietly. Westfield nodded as if he'd expected this answer. I've been watching this industry for years. I've seen brilliant people overlooked because they don't fit someone's idea of what a leader should look like. It's not just wrong, it's a waste of talent. Bad for business. Thomas wasn't sure how to respond. He'd never heard a CEO talk this way, especially not to someone like him. Here's my proposition, Mr. Jackson, Westfield continued. Nexus Aerospace is opening a new testing facility here in Atlanta. We need someone to head up our quality control division, someone who understands how these components perform in the real world and who won't compromise on safety no matter who's applying pressure. Thomas felt as if the air had been sucked from the room. Was this really happening? Sir, I'm just a mechanic. I don't have management experience. Chen spoke up. You have leadership experience. We checked with your colleagues. You train the new hires. People come to you when they're stuck on a problem. You lead by example and expertise, not by title. This would be a significant change, Westfield acknowledged. Different environment, different challenges. But the core of the job is what you already do. Making sure things are done right, that nothing unsafe makes it into the field. Thomas tried to process what he was hearing. What exactly would the job involve? Overseeing quality testing for new components, building and leading a team of inspectors, helping develop testing protocols that reflect real-world conditions. The salary, Westfield mentioned a figure that made Thomas blink, would reflect the responsibility of the position. It was more than double what he currently made. The kind of money that could pay off his house years early, help put his kids through college without loans. I understand this is a lot to take in, Westfield said, noting Thomas's expression. You don't need to decide right now. Take a week to think about it, discuss it with your family. Chen handed Thomas a business card. My direct line. Call anytime, with questions. If you're interested, we can arrange for you to tour the facility, meet some of the team. Thomas took the card, still feeling like he might wake up at any moment. Thank you, I will. As they stood to conclude the meeting, Westfield offered his hand again. One more thing, Mr. Jackson. If you join us, I want you to build your own team. Find people who've been overlooked like you have. Good people who didn't get a fair shot. The industry is full of them. Thomas shook his hand, finding his voice. Why me? There are thousands of aircraft mechanics. Westfield's answer was simple. Because when it mattered, you made the right call. And from what I hear, you always do. Walking out of the executive terminal into the bright afternoon sunlight, Thomas felt dazed. The weight of the business card in his pocket seemed to represent something larger, a door opening to a future he'd never imagined possible. He looked across the airfield to the maintenance hangars where he'd spent his entire career. Then he glanced down at the card in his hand, running his thumb over the embossed Nexus logo. Sometimes life changed in big, dramatic ways. And sometimes it changed because you simply did your job the right way, even when it would have been easier not to. Thomas sat at his kitchen table that evening, turning Chen's business card over in his hands while his wife Diane prepared dinner. The kids were upstairs doing homework, and the house was filled with the comforting smell of her famous pot roast. You've been quiet since you got home, Diane said, wiping her hands on a dish towel and sitting across from him. Did something happen at work? Thomas looked up, still trying to process the day's events himself. You could say that. He told her everything. The meeting with Westfield, the job offer, the salary. As he spoke, Diane's eyes grew wider. They want to pay you how much? She asked when he mentioned the figure. That was my reaction too, Thomas said with a small laugh. I almost asked him to repeat it to make sure I heard right. Diane reached across the table and took his hand. You deserve this, Thomas. You've worked so hard for so long. It's a big change, he said, voicing the concern that had been growing since he left the meeting. I've been fixing planes my whole career. This is management, leadership. What if I'm not cut out for it? The man with one of the biggest companies in the world thinks you are, Diane pointed out, and he's right. How many times have I heard you come home talking about showing the new guys the ropes? How many times have you stayed late to help someone else finish a job? She had a point. Thomas had always taken younger mechanics under his wing, showing them tricks of the trade that weren't in any manual. He'd never thought of it as leadership, just doing what was right. And besides, Diane continued, you said yourself they want someone who knows aircraft, who can spot problems. That's exactly what you do now. Thomas nodded slowly. They want me to tour the facility next week, see what I'd be getting into. Then you'll go, she said decisively. And you'll see. This is your moment, Thomas. His phone buzzed with a text from Luis. Did you get fired? What happened with the billionaire? Thomas smiled. His co-workers had been placing bets on the outcome of the meeting all week. None of them had guessed this. Not fired. Tell you tomorrow, he texted back. The next morning, Thomas arrived at work to find Luis and a few others waiting eagerly by his locker. Well? Luis demanded. What happened? Thomas tried to keep a straight face. Westfield offered me a job. The small group erupted in surprised exclamations. What kind of job? Asked Anthony. Head of quality control at his new aerospace facility, Thomas said, still finding the word strange in his mouth. Luis whistled low. Are you taking it? I'm thinking about it, Thomas replied, though in truth, after talking with Diane, he was leaning strongly toward yes. Going to check out the facility next week. Word spread quickly through the hangar. By lunchtime, even people Thomas barely knew were coming up to congratulate him. His supervisor, Bill, called him into the office again. Heard the news? Bill said. Can't say I'm surprised. You've always been one of our best. You're not upset? Thomas asked. Upset? Why would I be upset that one of my guys is moving up in the world? Bill shook his head. This place won't be the same without you, but I'd never stand in your way. The following Tuesday, Thomas took a personal day and drove to the address Chen had given him, a newly built facility on the outskirts of Atlanta. As he pulled into the visitor parking spot, he felt a flutter of nervousness in his stomach. He was dressed in his best clothes, pressed slacks and a button-down shirt that Diane had ironed twice. The building was sleek and modern, all glass and steel. Inside, the lobby featured a display of aircraft components in glass cases like museum pieces. At the reception desk, he gave his name and was told Mr. Chen was expecting him. Chen met him in the lobby, shaking his hand warmly. Mr. Jackson, glad you could make it. How are you feeling about everything? Still taking it all in, Thomas admitted honestly. Chen smiled understandingly. That's natural. Let me show you around, and maybe things will become clearer. What followed was a tour that opened Thomas's eyes to possibilities he'd never considered. The facility was state-of-the-art, with testing labs that simulated everything from high-altitude conditions to extreme temperatures. In one room, machines repeatedly stressed metal components until they failed, measuring exactly how much force they could withstand. This is where we'd want your expertise, Chen explained as they watched a technician examine a failed part. You've seen firsthand what happens when components deteriorate in real-world conditions. That knowledge is invaluable. They passed through a room where engineers were gathered around a table, arguing good-naturedly about a design modification. Right now, most of our team comes from engineering backgrounds, Chen said. They're brilliant with theory and design, but we need someone who can bridge the gap between theory and practice. Someone who can say, that looks good on paper, but here's what will happen after 5 years of actual use. Thomas nodded, beginning to see where he might fit into this world that had seemed so foreign just a week ago. The tour ended in a bright conference room overlooking the testing grounds. Westfield was there, reviewing documents with a young woman who was introduced as the head of engineering. Mr. Jackson, Westfield said, standing to greet him. What do you think of our operation? Impressive, Thomas said honestly. I've never seen testing this comprehensive. That's because most manufacturers cut corners, Westfield said bluntly. They test to minimum standards, not real-world conditions. He dismissed the engineer with a nod, and they sat down to talk. Have you had time to consider our offer? Westfield asked. Thomas took a deep breath. I have, and I have some questions. Go ahead. You're asking me to build a team. Would I have full control over who I hire? Westfield nodded. Complete authority. Your team, your choices, and if I see problems with a design or component, even if it delays production or increases costs. That's exactly why we want you, Westfield said firmly. Your job would be to find problems before they become disasters. If that means sending engineers back to the drawing board or scrapping a component that doesn't meet standards, so be it. Thomas considered this. It aligned with his values, putting safety above convenience, above cost, above schedules. One more question, he said. Why this focus on quality? Most businesses are all about cutting costs, getting products out the door faster. Westfield leaned forward. When I was 19, my brother died in a small plane crash. Mechanical failure. A part that should have been replaced wasn't because someone decided it could last a little longer. His voice was steady but tinged with old pain. I learned then that in aviation, there are no small shortcuts. Every component matters. Every inspection matters. The personal revelation surprised Thomas. It wasn't what he'd expected from a billionaire CEO. So, Westfield said after a moment, what do you think? Would you like to join us? Thomas thought about his years in the hangar, the pride he took in his work, and the frustration of watching less qualified people move ahead. He thought about what he could build here, a team that valued expertise and integrity over everything else. Yes, he said, extending his hand. I would. Westfield's face broke into a genuine smile as they shook hands. Excellent. When can you start? I'll need to give notice. 2 weeks. Perfect. That gives us time to set up your office and prepare for your arrival. Westfield stood. Welcome to Nexus Aerospace, Mr. Jackson. As Thomas drove home that afternoon, he felt a strange mix of emotions: excitement about the future, nostalgia for the career he was leaving behind, and most of all, a sense of validation. After 15 years of doing his job with unwavering integrity, someone had finally seen his worth. He smiled as he pulled into his driveway, eager to tell Diane the news. Sometimes doing the right thing paid off in ways you never expected. 6 months later, Thomas Jackson walked through the doors of Nexus Aerospace wearing a tailored Navy suit instead of his old mechanic's uniform. The receptionist greeted him by name, not Mr. Jackson but Thomas, just as he'd insisted from his first day. He believed titles created unnecessary distance between people who needed to work closely together. His office overlooked the testing floor, where his team was currently putting a new hydraulic component through stress tests. Through the large window, he could see David, a former military aircraft mechanic he'd hired, carefully examining pressure readings while talking to 2 engineers. Thomas smiled at the sight. David had been working as a gas station attendant when Thomas found him, his military experience overlooked by civilian employers who didn't understand how his skills translated. Now he was one of the most valuable members of the quality control team. The phone on Thomas's desk rang. It was Chen. Thomas, Westfield is bringing some investors through today. He'd like you to give them a tour of your department around 2 o'clock. No problem, Thomas replied. He'd gotten used to these tours. Over the past months, Westfield often brought important visitors to see the quality control division, his pride and joy as he called it. Before heading to his morning meeting, Thomas stopped by his credenza where a glass case held a bent and fractured piece of metal, the hydraulic component he'd replaced on Westfield's jet that fateful day. Westfield had given it to him as an office-warming gift, mounted on a simple wooden base with a small plaque that read, "Sometimes the most important decision is saying no." It served as a daily reminder of why Thomas was here and what was at stake in their work. The morning passed quickly in meetings and reviews. At lunch, Thomas sat in the company cafeteria with his team rather than in the executive dining room. It was a practice he'd started his first week, wanting to stay connected to the people doing the hands-on work. Today, they were discussing a new testing protocol for components that would be used in extreme cold conditions. The standard tests don't go low enough, argued Patrice, a brilliant young woman Thomas had recruited from a community college engineering program. If these parts are going into aircraft that fly polar routes, they need to withstand temperatures at least 10 degrees colder than the current testing requires. Thomas nodded. Write up the proposal. I'll make sure it gets implemented. This was what he loved most about his new role: the ability to make real changes, to push standards higher, to possibly save lives through attention to detail that others might overlook. At 2 o'clock, Thomas met Westfield and a group of 5 investors in the lobby. They wore expensive suits and had the confident bearing of people accustomed to wealth and influence. "Gentlemen, this is Thomas Jackson, head of our quality control division," Westfield introduced him with evident pride. "He's the reason your flights on Nexus-manufactured aircraft will be the safest in the sky." Thomas shook hands with each man, noting their surprised expressions when Westfield described his background as an aircraft mechanic, rather than an engineer or business school graduate. "Thomas brings something invaluable to our operation," Westfield explained as they walked toward the testing area. "Real-world experience with how aircraft components perform and fail over time. Theory is important, but nothing replaces hands-on knowledge." As they toured the facility, Thomas explained the rigorous testing each component underwent before approval, testing that often exceeded industry standards by significant margins. "Isn't that costly?" one investor asked. "Running tests beyond what regulations require." "Less costly than a single failure in flight," Thomas replied without hesitation. "Less costly than a human life." The investor nodded slowly, seemingly impressed by the direct answer. After showing them the testing labs and introducing key team members, Thomas brought the group to a special display area where failed components were exhibited alongside their improved replacements. "This," he said, pointing to a cracked turbine blade, "is what happens when a perfectly acceptable part by current standards encounters conditions just 5% more stressful than expected. And this," he indicated the redesigned version, "is our solution, a component that can handle stress 30% beyond what would ever be encountered in normal operation. The extra margin of safety means these parts won't fail even under extreme conditions," Westfield added. "That's the nexus difference." As the tour concluded, one of the investors, an older man who had been mostly quiet throughout, approached Thomas. "Mr. Jackson, I fly private jets myself. Been doing so for 30 years, he said. "I've always worried about the corners that get cut in maintenance and manufacturing. What you're doing here?" He paused, seemingly searching for the right words. "It matters. Thank you." Thomas was caught off guard by the sincere appreciation. "Just doing my job, sir." After the investors left, Westfield stayed behind. "You're good at this," he said. "Not just the technical side, but explaining our mission to people who don't have your expertise." Thomas shrugged. "I just tell them the truth." "Exactly. That's surprisingly rare in business." Westfield checked his watch. "I have another meeting, but I wanted to let you know. The board approved your proposal for the apprenticeship program." Thomas broke into a wide smile. The program had been his idea, a paid training initiative for mechanics from underrepresented backgrounds, giving them the skills to move into quality control and technical management. "That's fantastic news," he said. "When can we start recruiting?" "Immediately. It's your program. Run with it." As Westfield walked away, Thomas felt a wave of satisfaction. In just 6 months, he'd not only adapted to his new role, but had begun making the kind of changes he'd always thought were needed in the industry. Later that afternoon, Thomas called his old supervisor, Bill, who had become a friend and occasional advisor. "How's life in the fancy office?" Bill teased when he answered. "Different," Thomas admitted. "But good different. Listen, we're starting that apprenticeship program I told you about. I want to come by the hangar next week, talk to some of your people who might be interested." "I've got at least 3 mechanics who would be perfect," Bill said. "I'll hate to lose them, but this is a great opportunity." After they hung up, Thomas walked to the window overlooking the testing floor. His team was wrapping up for the day, talking and laughing as they logged their final results. 6 months ago, most of them had been overlooked, undervalued, or out of work entirely. Now they were helping set new standards for an entire industry, all because he'd refused to let a plane take off with a damaged part, even when it would have been easier to look the other way. Thomas thought about the many times in his career when standing firm had cost him, promotions denied, opportunities missed, subtle barriers encountered. For years he'd wondered if doing the right thing really mattered in the end. Now he had his answer. It mattered. Sometimes it just took a while for the world to catch up.